It ain't complicated, you know, man. I got dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Gio. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
Good. I'm kind of reeling from the Boomhauer intro.
I've created a new genre. I call it Boomhauer Wave.
Oh man. There was one I saw the other day of Boomhauer next to a Majravika what do they call it? Mandala. Where it's like, oh dang old man, was samsara, man, is life, death, rebirth, man. Like it was funny. But yeah, man, I'm doing good. I usually don't do it night times nowadays, but it's pretty, it's a different vibe. I feel different vibe at nighttime. You can be yourself more,
Yeah, I enjoy the nighttime streams because it does make it feel a little bit more, a little bit more professional, a little bit more like late night television. And as someone who's really intending to end up as the the combination of like Larry King and Rush Limbaugh, so that's really the feel we're going.
That could work though. That was like, have you ever heard of the show Hot Seat with Wally George?
No, I haven't. Enlighten me.
Okay, so back in the 80s, although you could find the clips on YouTube, because some of them became pretty memorable, especially the one with the band The Mentors. Wally George had this like conservative, like conservatard, like Reaganite show where it was kind of like, imagine if you took like Bill O'Reilly and Jerry Springer, and like that's what it was. It was called Hot Seat. It was kind of, and it's funny because it was the same as like Morton Downey Jr., but then he like hated Morton Downey Jr. He was like a pure Reagan shill. Like he was like a kosher conservative. Like, so this is the 1980s. So he was like, we have to go after Iran because of Yasser Arafat. And then you get like a pro-Iran guy on, or you get like some kind of like weirdo. Like he had Timothy Leary on. He had like Guar. Oh, the Guar episode was quite funny. The Guar episode where Dave Brocky was like, "I personally think we should crucify you." That was amazing. He would get like freaks on. Yeah.
I will admit that every once in a while, and it really strikes me like only every year or two, I just spend a day just like kind of reveling in the ashes of our culture, watching daytime television like Maury, just going on YouTube and find all the compilations of just the absolute degeneracy of the people that are on those shows. And it is kind of, to a certain degree, it reads like like a r/polyamory, like almost like it's
you didn't have to wait for daytime television. Just go on Reddit and you'll find it.
Yeah, really, millennials have just provided it to us for free.
Yeah, the millennial polycule, like the millennial polycule Giga Longhouse will never leave us. But no, I know what you mean. Like I was a huge fan of I used to watch Dr. Phil a lot, but then I was like, then he got like kind of woke, and I was like, oh no. But then I used to watch Steve Wilkos. But when I first watched it, I was younger. It was the first few seasons when Steve Wilkos was like actually edgy, and I had to like stay up late at night, like way past my bedtime. And it was like gritty and raw, and he would throw the chairs, and like the one was like Devil Mom. That was hair raising. But I know what you mean. Like, yeah, once in a while you'll see Mari, or you'll see like Steve Wilkos, what he is nowadays. It's like, oh man.
How the mighty have fallen.
Yeah. But what's funny is that with Wally George, Jim Goad was on actually with his late wife when they did the whole like punk kayfabe thing, and they had it was like sort of like 90s trash, underground trash. What was it called? Call Me magazine, where you had like the 12-issue magazine, and it was filled with like the edgiest things known to man. And I believe he said like actual like real life crimes were inspired by his magazine. But that was a particularly funny episode. But now, I mean, Jim Goad's a kind of an interesting figure because I think he represents like a sort of like older Gen X. I know like people would say like older Gen X nihilism, but I mean, maybe, I don't know. I think that, millennials have just a different, as a core millennial myself, I think that there's just a different vibe to like how millennials took sincerity, because like the whole like Chapo like irony cell, like have a normal one, go to a bush party, get drunk on IPAs, have sex sort of thing. That is sort of like the millennial cope disposition, is that we live in hell. But it's like, if you say that we live in hell, then it's like, whoa, Batman, that's harshing the vibes. And like live in your polycule and drink IPAs and smoke, government provided weed. Well, I mean, I'm Canada, so that's probably like, yeah, like Canada really is like the millennial paradise, I feel. Yeah. I mean, by paradise I mean hell on earth, but well. Anyways, I'm just rambling right now. But
no, not at all. And it's interesting you bring up being kind of a core millennial, because being kind of an older Zoomer, right? I'm 23. That question of sincerity, I feel like, is, I guess, almost one of the defining like generational distinctions, right? Because I was hanging out with, I said before, I went fishing with my grandpa today, and he's a core boomer. And one of the most endearing things,
is he the Reagan generation boomer, or is he like an older boomer?
Oh no, he was born in 1948. So
okay, he's a real boomer. Yeah, he's a real
genuine, actual baby boomer. Like his dad was a World War II kind of boomer, but not just has a lawnmower boomer. But regardless, and it's interesting because one of the most kind of irritating and yet kind of comforting things about that generation is their full-on sincerity. Being kind of in the the Bible Belt, right? Like every boomer is incredibly sincere about like Jesus and George Bush and Ronald Reagan in no particular order. And it is interesting because their children, right? My parents' generation were that kind of like extreme Gen X cynicism, that you saw in kind of like that underground like magazine culture, or even in like the music. And to me, it's kind of the reaction to kind of Gen X cynicism wasn't, kind of a return to sincerity. It was it was like a return almost to like fake emotive sincerity, so instead of being real, just doing things, it's this kind of, and this is very typical of Gio, your generation. Sorry to just, do all the broad brush, but the whole, like the kind of performative emotism of like, oh, boys can cry, and kind of things like that, where it's not, someone genuinely crying. It is someone, crying or someone emoting to be seen as someone who does such a thing, because that's kind of like a high status thing to do. So we've almost, it's like invented an even higher level of sincerity. That's not a word, of kind of like fake, like second order.
Well, you could say post sincerity, maybe.
Yeah,
like,
post sincerity. That's a much better term.
A little bit, yeah. Oh, go ahead. No,
carry on.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, it's true. I think what you were saying, it's true about millennials. I think that it's the appearance of something rather than the thing itself, because a lot of it is that I think older and core millennials are basically like, in a way, spiritual reverberations of Gen X. Like we looked up to our older Gen X siblings and cousins. Well, in my case, cousins. And we're sort of like, oh, they're cool. Like, it's like they had emo. We have their own version of emo. It's like they, I think it's a lot of it's like that. Like it's sort of millennial culture. You can't really, I think, the work that like, people like me and Catherine D and other people do. It's like, it's important because I feel that the millennials are getting erased. And what I mean by that is I think that pop culture and like advertisement and consumerism are pretty much a good metric onto like how you, what the importance of each generation is. Because I think even the term generation, like the sort of generational consciousness is a very recent thing, you could say. And I think that, when you look at advertisements and you look at like even like Hallmark movies, that's a good example. They're all aging Gen Xers, more or less. They're either aging Gen Xers, or they're, depending on the demographic, they're still boomers, or they are like young Zoomers. There's no millennials anywhere, because we have no purchasing power. That's like the simplest explanation. But also I think that the cultural hallmarks of the millennials are sort of either eclectically borrowed from other generations, or they're just like non-existent. I hate to say it. So we are slowly being erased. Like we're sort of, as much as I rag on Chapo, they termed it very well. We're just like the failed child generation, where, you know what I mean? Like we were supposed to be the expectations of the older boomers. And then it's sort of like we failed. And now the Zoomers, the great grandkids or grandkids are going to like take the torch of the global empire, if you will. Like that's, yeah. But sorry, I cut you off, Jay. So
no, not at all. I wonder how much of that too, the fact that the Zoomers have kind of taken over, is that, to me, the quote unquote interesting thing about Zoomers is that they're young.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be some kind of like real vibrant culture, because kind of the trends of, atomization and deracination that we saw in, your age cohort have kind of continued at an ever increasing rate. So, the technological advances of, the internet and streaming services kind of enabled old culture to stick around forever. So you see this in kind of the stat about, how much old music is still listened to, how many old songs are would be in the quote unquote digital top 40 and things like that, and so it is this, I wonder if kind of millennials have been, as they have aged, they're no longer quote unquote interesting. There's nothing like kind of like new and like novel about them. And to me, I don't know if Gen Z has brought anything extra to the table other than being, the new generation. And so I very much wonder if we're going to kind of see a similar thing where there's kind of a lack of, because at least to me, like, I don't know if and obviously like it's, who knows, it's a relatively young generation, but I don't know if I've seen any like great Gen Z work of art yet, great Gen Z culture. And so who knows, maybe that's me just being, overly harsh on us, if we're, speaking in these terms. But to me, I wonder if that's just kind of how things work now.
I think that when it comes to generational works of art, it's always, it's tricky because it's more of what a generation chooses to embrace as themselves. Because as you know, and this is especially true with music, although less true nowadays, I feel, it's always the generation previous that is giving those cultural products to the newer generation. And it's a choice whether that generation takes it up or not. So a lot of the musicians we grew up with as millennials, we're basically Gen Xers, right? So I think, or older millennials, like maybe older millennials, but by the time you have like nowadays, like My Chemical Romance Revival Tour, they're all like in their 40s, it's not very good. But I think what you mean is that point in that when it comes to Zoomers, I feel that because they've been so thoroughly baked at such a young age into a media ecology, they're going to produce different, they're essentially taking on schizoculture, more or less. They're really going to, and for good or for bad, I mean, they're going to sort of exist within a hypermedia environment. Whereas us millennials, we pioneered that, but yet we weren't like marinated in it from a very early age. So that's why you have this incredible pull towards nostalgia among millennials. So for instance, like I remember when I was a kid growing up here in Ontario, there's this channel called Retro Ontario. And I'm like, man, I remember like those like Teletoon buffers they would play during, like, for example, nowadays, Halloween, right? They would play these things and it would be like these different buffers. It's like they have a whole compilation of that. And it's like, if you're even older, if you're a Gen Xer, they'll have some like 80s, whatever. So the point being is that, yeah, digital media has in a way revived culture and has created a sort of nostalgia complex, especially for millennials. But at the same time, it's sort of regressive in the sense of like it's keeping you there in that moment. Whereas when Zoomers engage, and it's a meme on Twitter, even it's a meme online where it's like, Zoomers discover the problematic, what was it recently? Like anything, if they discover some kind of like TV show or like older version that we grew up with, it's like, oh, Zoomers discover Mean Girls. It's like, that's like the core millennial movie, right? Like they're going to have a different engagement on it. They're not going to have the same cultural signifiers because they don't have that nostalgia complex. But unfortunately, because millennials overwhelmingly now are taking up these positions, at least in a minor level, not like a major level, because Gen Xers still control, they're going to be the last generation with any sort of cultural political power. Millennial like writing staff people, they'll like strip mine their own childhoods to like create some abomination like Euphoria or whatever, or and they'll like give you a millennial interpretation of what they think a Zoomer is, as like basically more radical than whatever a millennial was. But the Zoomers that I know, they talk to me, they're like, yeah, like, Euphoria is not us. It's this weird hybrid. It's like, that's the problem I feel, is that because there's such a huge it's almost like the greatest generation being disconnected from their boomer kids. It's almost that level of cultural disconnect. Although I would say the Zoomers are not immune from this. A lot of Zoomers have adopted a lot of attitudes of their older millennial siblings. I keep saying millennials because of a certain anime forum that people know about. I keep saying the term millennials, but not the 4chan one, even smaller than 4chan. But yeah, sure.
That's one of the other things that I do think is interesting, is that the idea of having kind of like a common generational culture, I feel like, is getting more and more difficult.
Yeah,
so when
that
I'm trying
doesn't
to
exist
think
anymore.
what people my age are all united by, it's like, okay, maybe Cartoon Network, maybe SpongeBob, and even then that's like a maybe, and so it's this odd experience. And I see Chris Gard in chat talking about how difficult it can be to talk to Zoomers, just a completely different language. It's actually, I kind of relate to that, because there are kind of these eternal like micro cultures that you can see people get sucked into, and it's almost impenetrable from the outside looking in. And that doesn't mean that there aren't normal people, right? Like there is an average, in any group.
Well, you mean a normie can't understand GigaChat dialogues with Imp-Jacks and talking about marital, what? It's
Me explaining to my grandpa how the soy jack I made of David French is actually cool and interesting and not completely bad.
It's funny because I put this meme up on Digital Archipelago, this tweet about Jonathan Bowden, and it's like even like the most minor figures, like I think the account was called like Joseph Cotto Griper, and I'm like, what? And Prude's like, I'm so glad there's a Joseph Cotto Griper, and I'm like, what? Why? Like Scott Greer Griper. Maybe one day I'll be big enough. There'll be a there'll be a giant Geo Griper. Maybe that's in the works. Who knows?
Well, one of the other things that I think has been interesting, and so I was recently talking to my dad, who's fairly young. He's in his mid-40s, and some of his friends.
Whoa, my dad just turned 60. Whoa.
Well, that's that Bible Belt small generation gaps, right?
Yeah.
But regardless.
So your dad's a Gen Xer then?
Yeah, core Gen Xer, and that's a pretty common gap. And I think that there is a kind of some type of, I guess, like common ground between Gen Z and Gen X, especially over humor. Like I talked to Semi Agog and Oliver about this, right? That there is that kind of like bizarre, like ironic absurdity that you see across things. Like obviously like extreme kind of like hyper digital culture, like hyper pop, like 100 gecs, or even like a lot of like, kind of like right-wing edits, that is like extremely
hyper pop is sort of like the sort of like, you have to take funny pills to listen to hyperpop, though. You have to take certain hormonal treatments. That's like their equivalent of like right-wing Hyperborean edits or whatever. It's like,
well, true, but I'm saying that there's kind of a common ground between the two of those, like a Venn diagram of just like pure data that you have to just like support your brain in. But I would argue that you kind of see a crossover into like kind of like Gen X humor and things like, I'm trying to think of like kind of like the adult animation of the 90s. Ground in humor, and kind of also in like with people like, you see this with people like Stained Haynes, even kind of like 90s zine and kind of like bumper sticker culture. Like my dad, this is just a stupid example, but on his like horrible 70s hatchback when he drove to high school, and he had a sticker that said came to Vegas for the whores, stayed for the goats. Which is just stupid.
You could never have that now.
But it makes me laugh. And like you could put that on a stupid, like if you edited that would be a dumb telegram.
Yeah.
So my point is, do think there's some kind of crossover appeal, at least as far as humor goes. But it's interesting. It's interesting you bring up Bowden, right? Because my favorite thing by Bowden, really, obviously has great speeches and stuff, is that collection, Pulp Fascism, that I think Spencer, maybe a few other guys did. And he essentially makes the point that, right, like as kind of right-wing ideas became more and more taboo, or traditional ideas, we wouldn't call them right-wing, that they kind of they had to kind of go downstream into kind of what would have been, lower culture in another time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's something that, I don't know, there's kind of a growing appreciation on the right for kind of like pop and for kind of like pulp culture, the kind of like, I guess, the kind of things that the people in the nosebleeds want to see. And to me, it's something that you've brought up a lot with your kind of analysis of wrestling. I'll be the first one to admit I know nothing about wrestling, but there does seem to be some kind of, I guess, like burgeoning right-wing consciousness about pop culture and pulp culture.
Well, it's been there for a while. I think that it's become more sophisticated to the point of like actually creating, it's like my friend Astro had that one tweet that went viral. It's like all the things you thought were cool at 12 years old actually is cool. Pulp, Pulp, Conan, metal music, big boobs, all of it. It's cool. But I think that there are people that are actually like creating it, whether it's, Dave Bizarchives along with like Trad Western Art, or what does he go by? Oris Press. Or like, other people too, Reagan Lodge. Like there are people that create, but I think that it stems largely from the original alt-right, where they would, who was that guy that was on TRS that did the Merchant Minute? I'm
the wrong person to ask.
Oh, Miracu. Yeah. He would like take the pop songs. Him and like Walt Bismarck would like take pop songs and they would like, or they would take like Disney songs and they would like edit it and make it sort of like into these like Fashigoi edit stuff. Like, I think like that was a very crude, and same with Fashwave was like a very crude mock-up of what later people would actually try to create in terms of, but certainly in terms of like the awareness of pop culture, especially like film analysis. I mean, everyone has pretty much done their own like dabbling in it, like including myself. But then there are people
to kind of tie this back into what we were saying earlier. I think there is something deeply appealing in the kind of like the pulp aesthetic that is inherently sincere. It's impossible to kind of do like a wink at the camera, like, oh, I'm only ironically, writing a book with a guy with big muscles. Like it's all a joke, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
When you see it tried, and I think this is kind of the story. And I'm not trying to get into the franchise conversation, but when you see these kind of like more legacy franchises that have those kind of like pulp, sincere, big man with muscles, I guess, themes in them, the moment they get exposed to that kind of like toxic internet irony, they just die. There's kind of like nothing left in them. And it just leaves this like horrible shell. It's like, oh, it's Captain America, but he winks at the camera, and maybe makes a joke afterward. It's all a joke, guys. No one really thinks it. And to me, like, I do think that is to a certain extent a return, with the V instead, to sincerity.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think that, Millennials pioneered this sort of ironic humor with like those movies, like, they were so terrible. They were so like, they would just like, it was like right before the internet like took hold of public consciousness.
Like so Scary Movie and all that.
Yeah, Scary Movie was the first one. Yeah. Then you had like Disaster Movie, like Love Movie. Like there was always like, I think it was the last ditch effort of Hollywood to satirize itself before the internet. Like they knew the internet was going to take over everything. So they don't really notice how those movies never get made anymore because you don't need them. Because like, people on YouTube would do these parodies and like, people nowadays, they just find this content viscerally disgusting. I mean, unless you're some like, there was this great thread on this one particular anime forum that speaking of Giga Chad dialogues and speaking of gripers, there was the original gripers, not the other kind of griper. There was this great thread on this one particular forum, Amarna forums, where they talked about the difference between what they call an actual core hipster that was into eclectic culture and did find like even an ironic and humorous way to like get so socially like involved in a certain particular micro niche interest, even if it was just for the irony of it. The difference is nowadays, all of those millennials grew up and now they've become what they termed the soegalitarian, where the soegalitarian must like purely embraces the sort of, I would say postmodern, but now it's pretty much hypermodern collapse of high and low culture to where like Marvel cape shit is now like high culture to them. And everything must be consumed with an equal vigor as the most niche of niche interests. So it's kind of weird how they'll like, I don't know, listen to Meshuggah and they'll still like watch Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's like, how do you reconcile those two? It's like impossible. And even like you mentioned pro wrestling, unfortunately nowadays pro wrestling is sort of like, in North America at least, being taken over into like the annals of like millennial hipsterdom in the Reddit crowd. Like AEW is the perfect example of this. If you ever like watch their little humor and those little segments they do and the way they wrestle and the sort of supreme athleticism trumping an actual flow of a convincing wrestling match, that's like, you know, that's basically what it is. But, you know, and all things are subject to this. But the hipster was different, though. The millennial hipster, I think, still had a capacity for sort of strange authenticity. But, I mean, that's gone now, unfortunately. So I think, like, on the right wing, the only genuine hipsterism you can even get nowadays is probably on the right wing. Because there is that sort of siege mentality that breeds a particular form of cultural interest in things that are long forgotten. And so like Halloween, for example, is coming up and, you know, at the time of this broadcast, and, you know, it's like a lot of horror schlock is kind of like being coded in right-wing terms. And you even have this subversion now. You have like woke horror, like you have anything, what's the guy what's it called? Get Out. What's the guy's name? Keenan?
Oh, Black M. Night Shyamalan. What's his name?
Yeah. Not Keenan Ivory Wayne's. No, the other guy, not Peele, Jordan Peele. Yeah, not the good one, Jordan Peele. So no, but then you do, even nowadays, apparently my friend Kino Corner said that this new Barbarian movie is pretty good, even though that like has the same setup as like, you know, typical millennial Zoomer like horror schlock movie. Like, yeah, but I think that there is something to be said about why it is that sincerity is like sort of this weird commodity nowadays, that even that becomes subject to. Anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Well, and it's an odd position to find yourself in, because to a certain extent, sincerity never used to be a choice. You know, sincerity was kind of the baseline way that humans interacted with the world. But now, like so many other things, and I don't mean to speak on your behalf, but to me, when I hear the phrase, you know, postmodern traditionalist or postmodern conservative, it's very much that kind of like realization that the things that are natural and kind of, you know, would have been kind of the well-worn channels in society are now kind of active choices. And so to a certain extent, you do have to kind of LARP sincerity. Yeah. You know, and C.S. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity, that to kind of do anything, you do have to play pretend, you know, at least at first. Yeah. And so it is an odd position to find ourselves in. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
No, 100%. I think that's, well, I use the term because it's sort of recognition of the condition we live in. It's sort of like a stratagem of not getting out of, but sort of seeing through what we're living in. And the only way you could probably capitulate to sort of traditionalism is if you deal with the fact that we live in the times that we live in. And I wouldn't even say that we live in like pure postmodernity. I think that for a time there was, I mean, certainly at the end of the 1990s there was, but it's nowadays, I mean, we live in something far worse than postmodernity, but that's, you know, that's another issue. That's semantics, but yeah.
No,
I know what you mean.
I'm curious what you're getting at there. What do you mean that we're in an era of kind of after postmodernity?
Well, I think that it's sort of like how right-wingers back in like 2015 and 2016, they tried to do this thing where they'll like take, they're like, oh, metamodernism seems good because it's sort of like doing this synthesis of modernism and postmodernism. But really, you got to realize that metamodernism is basically a creation of our enemies. People like, you know, I shouldn't even mention his name. He's that much of a demon. But, you know, the guy that bankrolls Shia LaBeouf. He's a notorious doxer. Luke Turner. But people like him and like other people that sort of, what metamodernism essentially was, libs giving them the capacity for sincerity again. They're like, okay, I guess we could like feel things again. But sorry, go ahead, Jay.
No. Before we go on, can you define that term metamodernism? Because it's not.
Oh, that's another thing. It's very hard to define. Basically, metamodernism they think is like postmodernism, where it sort of sways between what modernism was and what postmodernism is, meaning that you can have meta structures, but they're not that solid, or you can have sincerity, but it's like still within the sort of auspices of postmodernism. It's a very hard to define term. It's kind of like postmodernism itself, but essentially it's sort of like the oscillation. They always use the word oscillation. That's their big word between what modernism is and what postmodernism is. So for example, New Sincerity would be a form of metamodernism in a way. But a lot of right wingers, they try to like use this and be like, well, instead of like fully embracing postmodernism, because postmodernism is a no-no word. It's an evil, bad word. Created by French intellectuals. So we can't have that, God forbid. So instead we're like, oh, metamodernism is this cool new idea where we can still have the sort of sincerity of modernist project, but it's still recognizing that we live in postmodernity. Unfortunately, though, metamodernism is a very liberal concept. Metamodernism is essentially the end of history liberal project of, we can have sincerity, but we have to realize that we live past the point of metastructures that hold us together. That's not real anymore. But we can sort of have this like emotivism that can become real to us. And so in a way, it's sort of like these libs creating metamodernism where like, so basically, we can't go totally into cynicism and irony because that leads to evil fascist things. So therefore, we have to give ourselves the capacity. You know what metamodernism is? It's essentially Reddit wholesome chungusness. That's what metamodernism is. So they're like, oh, we can't have total cynicism. We can't have total irreverence because that leads to fascism, as we've discovered because of the original alt-right and new reaction and like meme makers on Twitter during the Trump era. So like, oh, we can't have that anymore. So we can't have irony anymore. So it's like, what are we going to do? It's like, oh, we have post-irony. So it becomes this like Reddit wholesome chungusness of like me and my trans polycule smoking weed, watching Rick and Morty. That's like basically what that was the fruit of metamodernism. But I know I'm being too harsh on it, but I think that, so this question of right-wing postmodernism is sort of like a recognition of it. But I had this whole spiel actually thinking of the show. You wanted to ask me about postmodernism, but I'm just rambling. I had this thing. Well, go ahead. You go ahead. Sorry.
No, not at all. I'm curious to see where you're going. I was following.
Oh, okay. Well, I was watching. I'm getting through recently. Even though it takes me a long time to edit, especially this week, I have another Stain Haynes episode. You mentioned Stain Haynes. It's. I hate to say it. It's kind of. I gotta pare it for the public version. I gotta pare down his when we talk. Sometimes it takes me a longer time to edit. So. But we get into like zine culture and everything. But I had this spiel because I'm recently trying to get through the new Adam Curtis documentary. Did you hear about this? It's called Trauma Zone.
I've not, no.
Oh, Trauma Zone's amazing. It's his first non-narrative documentary. And essentially, I mean, I know he's releasing it now because unfortunately, Adam Curtis has become, just a standard British Britpopper lib. Voting Labour lib. So, he betrayed the hopes of his friend, Mark Fisher. But anyways, I think that still Adam Curtis, though, he still is a worthy documentarian. So essentially, it's his first non-narrative film where, usually he narrates the films, but it's about the decline and fall. It's the dying decade of the Soviet Union. He says the fall of communism and democracy. And it's basically, it has stock footage, it has archival footage of life in the Soviet Union, and it has text, and that's it. It doesn't have his narrative. And it's a really great film because it highlights, I mean, he's probably going to ruin it in the end with his social commentary about like the current conflict with blue and yellow. But I think that it's good to understand that when we talk about postmodernism, and I was talking about this with my friend in, I believe it was Content Minded episode 4, interview with the Russian insider. My friend works for the Russian state media, and I know I shouldn't admit that, especially in Canada. We have a very big and powerful blue-yellow lobby here in Canada because we have the largest diaspora of the blue-yellow people in Canada. So we have a very powerful blue-yellow lobby. It's kind of like the lobby that you guys have in the state. You're in the States, right, Jay?
I am, yes.
Yeah, it's kind of like that one lobby in the States, the Amish lobby in the States. But anyways,
the Amish.
Yeah, he's Kanye. He's going after the Amish people recently. So
it's all those places just kicking out the Amish.
I know, man. Yeah. Anyway, they're like, well, the Puritans, right? The Puritan lobby.
That's unironically true. The Amish were kicked out of a lot of places.
They were. They were.
Very different reasons.
For very different. Yeah, exactly. But so in Canada we have the blue-yellow lobby because they have the largest diaspora of people. And actually, did you know that those colorful people in Mariupol, that one particular meme battalion that everyone loves to talk about with the spinny wheels, starts with an A, ends with an Zav,
No offense, that's the worst self-censorship I've ever heard.
Can we say Azov on YouTube?
Look, I'll put it this way. I have Thomas on semi-regularly, so you'll be fine.
Well, did you know that Azov, with the very, very colorful spinny wheels, was actually trained by Canadian Special Forces? So there you go. But if I wore a spinny wheel shirt on downtown Bloor and Yonge, I would get arrested. I would be a Human Rights Commission case would be brought against me. So there you go. That's a little Canadian deep lore.
You say that, but at the gym I go to, there's a guy who's incredibly anime levels of jacked who wears a
like Thomas
black sun on the back of it.
Oh my god!
I talk to him, but I'm also halfway convinced he'll kill me. So I just kind of watch him, and it's
oh my god.
To be fair, he's putting it out there. But anyway, you were saying something about the Canadian government and the blue-yellow lobby.
Yeah, that they trained Azov. There's actual articles in the BBC about. No, I was saying about what was I saying? Oh, I was saying Adam Curtis would make some kind of flippant commentary about the Russia and the blue-yellow country. I don't know. Should I break out the Heil Putin? Nah, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to risk your channel. But does Thomas throw up the Heil Putlers, or is that?
Well, he does on Telegram. Thankfully not on my. But,
okay, good. I'm not gonna. Yeah, don't worry about it then. It's funny because he every single day on Telegram he'll go up and he'll be like, "Death to
Yeah.
Oh my god!
Great.
But anyway, so about the documentary, I know it takes 5 minutes to get to my point. It really shows the disintegration of Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, because I think that in the first time ever. Not the first time ever. There was many cases where a civilization took, let's call it foreign organisms in its cultural body that infected it, and they had no natural immunity, no natural sort of barrier towards, right? So for example, Europeans coming to the New World, I mean, we had diseases that we were accustomed to, or even for example, Mediterraneans and alcohol and bread. You know what I mean? Or milk, we're just naturally akin to this, but other peoples are not, because they don't have that genetic memory within them. So in a way, when you inflict this sort of shock doctrine, capitalist consumerism upon Russia, you have in some ways, and Adam Curtis is very good at pointing this out, you have this pure form of postmodernism where all of these different civilizations are clashing into one. And you have this utter mania, orgiastic frenzy towards rapid westernization of Russia. And you see this in the average person. And you see this, for example, in the way that sort of Soviet planned society kind of turned inward on itself. And for example, you have this one example, where they had the largest Trubant plant on the edge of Moscow, I believe. And they brought this economics guy in there and to be a commissar. But then after, he organized the looting of the Trabant plan by these gangsters who would later become core players of the Russian mafia. And they would organize looting on scientific game theory principles. And so this is the typical like Adam Curtis move, right? Where like these sort of managerial bodies of knowledge, because, you know, Adam Curtis is reading Freud, he's reading Adorno, he's reading Foucault. And so these bodies of knowledge create something that is in a way inverse to what they were meant for. So the Soviet Union will have all these like, crazy R-worded plans that, you know, for example, a laundromat had to be a scrapyard, you know, because they had this excess of scrap that they had to like have a quota for. Like, it's just really like just stupid, right? But that sort of logic of like terminal late stage Soviet managerialism, that furthered into this sort of like, now you have consumerism. Now you have like songs about Coca-Cola. You know, that's how the documentary opens, is like a Miss Poland contestant singing songs about Coca-Cola. Now you have this like disaster shock doctrine capitalism infecting the body of the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union. So now you have like these two radically different ways of life commingling, and you have this social chaos that's created from it. And you have this like total like disintegration of the social to the point where everything is just this madhouse. And then of course we all know what happened after Yeltsin, you know, the guy who stabilized everything. But you know, the point being is that when you see that this sort of like, even the notion of importing democracy into the Russian Federation, that itself is like insane, because really this sort of like Western notions of democracy and blah, 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 like we've, you know, for better, for worse, we've had this for hundreds of years, and we've sort of been marinated into this sort of cultural genetic memory of like what a society looks like. But when you sort of export this to the rest of the world, you create very crazy postmodern conditions where you have like, for example, when they had currency converting, they had like, they would set up their own collectives, but really they were just small businesses, right? By any other name, we would call them small businesses. But these were like the first oligarchs. So like, oh, so it's kind of like the Soviet state with their collective whatever, but then it's not. It's like kind of like the pseudo currency they had, but then it's real currency. It's like, that's, you know, that's pure postmodernism. And of course, you know, later, speaking of Putler, you know, the guy that got him elected worked in the avant-garde. He was originally an artist, an art director that worked in Paris in the Parisian avant-garde. And he like basically created postmodern chaos in Russian society, to which Putler would come in and when he was elected and like say, okay, now I'm going to mend this idea of what Russia is. And nowadays, even nowadays in the current conflict with Blue Yellow, this is like the ultimate, I think, expression of the Russians sort of looking towards its past and looking towards its future and seeing that like, okay, now we're this fully like anti-Western thing. We have to embrace it because we tried going the other way. It didn't work. So it's very complicated. It's almost like it is an existential sort of expression. But, you know, the point being is that I think Russia is a good case of where, you know, postmodernism was like basically given to people without the brakes, and it produced so much different contradictions. Whereas in the West, we have like a weaponized form of postmodernism that's not really truly postmodern, because we still have these like absolutely like R-worded values that are inflicted upon us, but they're done in a way that is ostensibly postmodern. They're done in a way that is spread through these infometrics and through these sort of mimetic antigens and contagions that infect the social body. But even though they're not wholly postmodern, because if we lived in a genuine postmodern, even like Frederick Jameson said this in his book, Postmodernism, The Logic of Late Capitalism, he said that, you know, a certain form of postmodernism would tend towards reactionary thought if given enough time, if given enough breath. So, you know, him being a Marxist who's like, oh, that's not very good, so we have to have like, you know, Marxian sincerity. Whereas the libs would be like, okay, we can't have full postmodernism because then that's not good, because then, you know, these right-wing shitlords will get a hold of it. And that's not, you can't have that, you know? So
well, your analogy to Russia, it reminds me very much of, you know, kind of how the first peoples, you know, kind of you know, of America and Canada interacted with alcohol.
Oh,
you know, they didn't really have the kind of like built up, in that case, literal cultural tolerance to it. You know, and so they kind of skipped the I guess, the cultural formation where you kind of learned the, I guess, like the practical limits of such a thing.
Right.
In privatization, obviously I'm not saying that, 90s American privatization was great, but at the very least, like we kind of had a tolerance for it. We knew what to expect, whereas if you essentially, it's very much like you said, you kind of just get this, this like toxic chemical dumped in your lap, with those things of what to do with it. And you shouldn't really be surprised when it starts to dissolve you to a certain degree.
Well, Gorbachev doing Kentucky Fried Chicken commercials. I mean, no wonder they hated him in Russia when he died. You know what I mean? Like that's what. Oh, speaking of which, did you see the Pizza Hut discourse recently?
No, I remember the ad he did, but I didn't see any conversation on it.
No, did you? Well, I know he did the ad for Pizza Hut, but recently with oh god, what's that one guy, Jack Posobiec? Like,
not at all. I don't mean to. I don't know that. I don't know him super well, but like the people in kind of like the ex alt-right are not figures. I guess I'm not. I don't have that much affection for, so I don't really follow him.
Me neither. No, me neither. But he did this thing about like how like 90s Pizza Hut was like a time when America was good, and then you have
yeah, I did see that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. That's what I was talking about. Then you have like these irony leftists. They're all the same, by the way. They all have the same like trashy pop culture, like avatars, and they all have the same attitude. And they all grew up on like upper middle class white kids listening to rap music, and they have this thing where it's like, bro, this is just consumerism. You're just worshiping consumerism. It's kind of like a more advanced version of like 50s worship of boomers, right? But then, the response by people like us, I saw this great tweet response. I think it was either Barack Obama or it was Nightmare Vision. God Close My Eyes, where it's like, wow, you mean to tell me that it's good when like America was like slightly functional, that we should go back to that? Whoa, it's like, that's evil, bro. In other words, like, it's kind of like a consumer schlock, like 90s culture meets Norman Rockwell. I think one irony bro said this. It's true. It is like stupid to be like, some normie con like Jack Posobiec worshiping 90s Pizza Hut. But it's true. You remember when you were a kid going to like Chuck E. Cheese or Pizza Hut, and like, you do have the nostalgia about it. But I think that, even that, it's like as much as these people are nostalgic over like early Simpsons, they'll still denigrate whatever the political right will say in terms of like this was a time in America when things were functional, or in North America. And I think that, it is stupid to worship a consumer brand, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, it's true. It's like, there was something to having that experience of being a millennial growing up in North America that was unique at the time. I mean, I said this on Telegram, by the way, go to my Telegram. I have like exclusive rants when, stuff that's too spicy for Twitter. I said this on Telegram once. I said that, if you weren't in the West, I mean, the 90s was pretty terrible. The 90s was hell on earth. If you were in Africa, Central Africa, or if you were in the Balkans or certain parts of Asia. But if you were in North America, yeah, the 90s was like a time when the world made sense. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that to denigrate, like, when America was actually semi-functional for once, when even like the race relations in America were sort of like on the track to be like somewhat normal and non-schizophrenic.
So I will say, I disagree with what you said about the race relation stuff, because I would argue that, and I realize this is a controversial topic, but I would argue that has been something that has been kind of successfully airbrushed, because like, for instance, right, with everything that happened.
Well, the early 90s, no, the early 90s was a disaster. Yeah,
but
you're right.
Post that, there was a lot of, I guess, racial violence that never really made the news. So for instance, like, and I wasn't around, but there was this, so Semi Agog was talking about this. Thomas has talked about this. And actually, incidentally, my dad as well, who's not at all political or doesn't even know I have the podcast. But what they've all mentioned is that there were kind of different, like, essentially like ethnic symbols, right? So that the crown was a big one, right? Like it would oftentimes be kind of like shiny, chintzy plastic. And essentially that sign, if that was left in your car, on your back, like parcel shelf or whatever, meant, you were essentially, you were a black guy. And so obviously that, make the we was Kangs jokes all you want, but essentially like it was an in-group marker, and it was a marker of both kind of like racial solidarity and also like, hey, don't rob me. You know, I'm one of you guys. And so like that's one symbol, but that symbol kind of became something like much more widely spread, which is why like if you even look at hip hop of the era, you see that symbol, you know. And so there was a lot of this like baseline.
Yeah, Rakim had that all the time.
Yeah, and so in a place like so there's kind of there's obviously I'm in the Bible Belt, but along the kind of like older rivers of the Bible Belt, we kind of have our own like Rust Belt in miniature. You know, and these are kind of old manufacturing towns that used to essentially ferry goods up and down the river.
Oh yeah.
And so a lot of these places got really, really rough during the 90s because they have, you know, a very diverse population. There was not a lot of economic opportunity there. And
like Gary, Indiana, for instance.
Yes, exactly. Just, you know, in the South, right? And
yeah, Canada, we have a similar vibe actually in certain places, but not as bad. But yeah, in my region where I live in Niagara, that's when things got really bad. Like in terms of manufacturing, like leaving. Yeah.
But my point is that all of those areas had a ton of violence. And a lot of it was extremely racialized. And so my point is not necessarily like that cultural meme exists for a good reason, you know, but I don't think I think it is a narrative that is not necessarily reflective of reality, because not only do you have just the baseline kind of like intergroup conflict, but also like a lot of the first round of what we would call wokeness was 90s campus culture.
Yeah.
You know, and it really did make much.
You're listening to Pearl Jam.
Right. It made deeper inroads into kind of American culture than we like to think. Like, I mean, to be honest, Kurt Cobain was an SJW. You know, he was just the SJW of.
He was a proto-male feminist, bro.
Yeah.
He was talking. Yeah, like he was talking about biological process. What do you think Penny Roll T was about, that song? What do you think that was about, right? So, yeah, man, he was. The song RP Me, you know, that was like, yeah, he went to Rock for Choice. Nirvana played there. So, anyways, go ahead, Jay. Sorry, I cut you off. Yeah. No, Kurt Cobain, I despise the fact that he's like a millennial icon.
Yeah, I do too. There's an interesting stream that Thomas and Ace from Loudside Epicenter did.
Yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah, where they're talking about the difference between, you know, Nirvana and Pantera. You know, how those are kind of like dueling sides of the same of culture. And look, I'll be honest, just if I had to pick one to listen to, it'd be Nirvana, you know, all politics aside. But that was an interesting conversation.
Oh no.
Yeah,
but yeah,
sorry, what can I say? It's the emo influence, you know.
You know what's funny? In my podcast with Matthew the Stout, we do style talks about our arts mostly. I had this thing about Paglia's concept of the beautiful boy. And in the 90s, you had a scale of the beautiful boy where, you know, on the one end, the very far end was Kurt Cobain, was like the ultimate beautiful boy, right? The middle, you had like Eddie Vedder. Or no, the middle you had like you kind of had like DiCaprio, Eddie Vedder, like, you know, they're sort of like skewed towards like a pure beautiful boy. But on the other end, you had like the chud version, which is Phil Anselmo from Pantera. Now, who do you think would win in a fight? Kurt Cobain or Phil Anselmo back in the day?
That would, if only. One can only hope.
Yeah, I'm talking Phil Anselmo, like 95 Phil Anselmo in his prime. Who do you think before the heroin addiction, who do you think would win that fight? It wouldn't be
I would argue that's a fight between two heroin addicts. I think that's even.
Yeah, true. I mean, I could just, can you imagine Kurt Cobain getting into a fight with Phil Anselmo back when they were in their prime? Yeah. When they were touring for Great Southern Trendkill. Yeah, that was, oh man, that would be brutal. But yeah. I mean, before Kurt Cobain, you know, sunsetted, obviously. But I think that you were saying about, well, what were they saying about? Yeah, because Pantera really was the music of like Heartland Chud America, 100%, more than Nirvana. Nirvana was a coastal city thing. Nirvana was like the effete liberal, soy egalitarian choice. Whereas Pantera, but then Pantera though was very interesting. I said this to Ace in our podcast, is that when you look out in those crowd, right? When you, especially during the Ozfest, the Oz tour, you see like attractive young blonde women at Pantera shows. Like, you know, nowadays, if you go to modern metal shows, I mean, this is not the case. But I think that because they embodied sort of like a cultural moment in Heartland America. But anyways, I cut you off, Jay. Is that what you're going to say? Or yeah?
No, I was just going to agree with you. And to me, it reminds me of a similar thing you see in punk music, right? Where if you look at, and there are people who are fond of saying this, like if you look at people like the Ramones, and compare that to kind of the, like what you said, like kind of the effete liberal, like punk scene where it's like no bigots in punk, it is just a different caliber of human.
Yeah.
It does seem that almost like and tell me if I'm getting at something here, because I know you're an artist, right? But as art became kind of gated by managerial institutions, right? Like, well, you're not an artist unless you have an art degree. You're not a musician unless you went to, NYU, and got a degree in music. That they kind of became more tame to a certain degree, right? Like they became kind of creatures of the regime. And you see the same thing. And look, I realize like journalists have always been, the absolute scum of the earth.
Oh yeah.
But there is fundamentally a difference in kind of like class and caste with kind of like the journalists of a previous generation. They were kind of the children of tradesmen. They were lower to middle class.
Oh yeah.
And that kind of spoke to a different sensibility than what we see now with my eternal internet nemesis, the destroyer of two of my Twitter accounts, Carlos Maza. Where
what happened with Carlos? You and Carlos? Oh man, that guy, he's the worst. Like he's the absolute.
There are two Anon accounts that I lost interacting with that fine gentleman.
Oh yeah, you always cap, never quote tweet, always cap. Man, yeah, he's the worst example. He is, I think, the most like if you had to pick a creature of the regime, him, I wouldn't even say Taylor Lorenz. I would say him. He would be like definitely, but like you were saying, yeah, I mean, older journalists like Michael Herr, when he wrote, what was that book called, Dispatches or Cables, or he was in Vietnam and he was like just this working class kid that like, back in the day, they would just let like normie, like college paper journalists go to Vietnam. Like, yeah, sure, you can go. Like, and he got shot down in a helicopter and like, but yeah, you were right. Like journalists very much, I think the problem is that with older journalists, like especially with boomer libs, they have like this cult of authenticity around like people like Dan Rather, who's like an absolute ghoul disinfo agent, but yet like he has this weird cult of authenticity because of the boomer libs who are still alive that like worship him as the symbol of like, this is what the media was like. But anyways, go ahead. Yeah, your point.
Well, and actually that's another, I guess factor of kind of post-modernity is there are so many, I guess, kind of parts of our daily life that are just almost exclusively narrativized. That we run like multiple generations now of journalists kind of coasting on the fumes that were kind of created in a different era. Like every journalist is 3 stages down from LARPing as gonzo journalists, that their parents probably didn't even.
Antifa accounts do this all the time, by the way. Like their tone, like meet so-and-so who is actually an Austrian painter fan on Twitter, who has a normie job in the sticks, and he's like a small town lawyer, but he posted a helper peppy once with an SS uniform. Therefore, the tone of voice very much is like, I'm impersonal as a sociologist, but I'm going into this deep, dark heart of the internet, whatever, right? Like online racism.
And I've been in my Telegram over the past week kind of bemoaning the current state of dialogue, because to me there's this frustrating dynamic where the right can't do anything. Really, like we can't accomplish anything. And the left can't tell the truth. And the left has, and obviously I'm not just saying like, oh, they're lying about the numbers. They're the whichever numbers I'm referring to, they're lying about. And I should say I support, the United States government, the nation of Israel, and the CDC in no particular order.
I support the Canadian Health Organization, and
you too. I also support them. But my point is,
yes, I support. I voted for Justin Trudeau. No, I can't lie that much. I support. Listen, Justin's a good guy, man. I'm a #1 Justin Trudeau fan account. Anyways,
but my point is that I'm not talking about a lie on that level. A simple misrepresentation of kind of numerical fact. But they can't reveal themselves for what they truly are. So they're stuck in this kind of eternal like denial of how much power they have. Whereas the right is constantly LARPing. It's like, oh, one day we're going to be on top. Like just one more election and we got them. Kind of like flexing in the face of, in the face of a power that they realistically can't do anything against. Whereas their opposition is constantly pretending like just one day, one vote doesn't go our way, and then the mustache man will return out of the grave.
The Austrian painter,
lead an army of backwoods Appalachian Ubermensch, out of the woods to destroy our.
He's going to paint more landscapes.
And the frustrating thing about it is that we never seem to escape that eternal cycle of the right can't act and the left can't tell the truth, and we just get stuck in that eternal cycle of, well, the left lies. And it's like, well, yes, we know they lie. What are you going to do about it? Well, we can't do anything. And on the other side, and then on the other side, it's like, oh, well, we're in charge.
No, I'm for posting Giga Chads, but
of course. And to me, it in all of that, the people I find just the most hateful, like the people I despise the most, other than white liberals who are just the scum of the earth and never forget. But it's the kind of like James Lindsay types who I despise with the fury of 1,000 suns. And maybe this dovetails with post-modernity, right? Because the real problem is that one day we woke up and decided to be postmodern. And if we just tried extra hard, we could win by showing them numbers and graphs and more reason and more facts. And it's just this, to me, maybe I'm going on it at length. But to me, it's this kind of like frustrating deadlock that we're in forever. And it's part of the reason that I have been kind of heartened to see like the increase, like the actual like cultural outcome from our friends, because it's something real and it's something new that isn't just, essentially, and I make fun of myself again, just, hey, I made a soy jack of the guy who's going to get me fired from my job.
Yeah. Carlos Meza soy jack. But are you done, Jay?
I am. Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I trailed off.
I think no, don't. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like the end of an Nine Inch Nails song. When it's done or not. But no. I think okay. So let's go back a little bit. Yeah. But I agree with your point there. I know it's something that distributist Dave, he always points to about the left can't tell the truth, the right wing can't act. Frankly, if we had our own like Antifa network and we like it wouldn't work because we're not in a position of political power. But I know that a lot of like the anon aspect, like the foot soldiers among the enemy ranks, they are also afraid of getting doxxed, and they're afraid of like whatever. They live in this paranoid fantasy world where like fashy Giga Chads are going to bust in their squatty trans squat house.
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah, we shall drive them into the sea. But no, yeah, I think that without political power, obviously, but I do think that there are steps you can take. Like, for example, that one guy that did the thread that I think he had to deactivate before they clipped him again, that really blew up on like Carlos Meza and Taylor Renz and other ones who are like super wealthy, rich kids that are LARPing as like working class journalist fighting the fash. You know what I mean? Like there was that thread that blew up recently. I think like there are strategic actions, and I think that in America you have way more of a chance. In Canada, as I've always said, this is any action is not going to happen. I don't think there is no natural right wing in Canada. That was long gone in the 50s. Trudeau Senior, that possibility is over. That's why most people on the political right in Canada, they end up just moving to America. And of course, there was also a pipeline there created by people like Ezra Levant to like filter like right wingers into America because of Mushuckles, right? So it's kind of, and a lot of those alt-right figures actually came from Canada, unfortunately. But anyways, I think that we skipped over the race relation aspect of it. You were sort of doubting the meme of like, in the 90s. I think what people mean is they mean like the early 2000s race relations got a little bit better. The meme like, Dave Chappelle destroyed racism and then Obama had to bring it back to get elected. That meme. But like you were saying, like this thing was always there. I mean, even Nightmare Vision, he had this, he tweeted out this animation that was in the middle of Bowling for Columbine, where Michael Moore, and I think like Michael Moore did something scummy where like he did this interview with Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and he implied that they did this animation, but they really didn't do it. It was like basically if you had to like take if you had to take like the apotheosis of what libs believe in terms of like American race relations and the NRA, it's this video. I don't know if you saw this, Jay. It was in the middle of Bowling for Columbine. It's a little animation where it's just like everything, like multiple lies, every single word and sentence. It was amazing. It was incredible. Did you see this?
I've seen it, and to me, it's worth your time. I don't know how you find it if you're not on Twitter. It just look up, Bowling for Columbine animation, and essentially
it's on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube.
Oh, fair enough then.
Yeah.
But it essentially to people who are are in the chat and don't want to look it up or on Spotify, it essentially describes the owning of weapons as exclusively something that white Southerners decided that they wanted because they were worried about slave revolts. And obviously that is ignoring a much broader tradition.
And they were peaceful and they didn't actually do anything. And it was just like white fear and fragility. And this was in 2002 that they put this out. So the anti-white stuff was sort of like in the background. It was sort of like given like the time of day, but it wasn't like the main focus. Now it's like the main.
Well, I also think that part of that is that the forces of our enemies didn't have quite the same, full spectrum dominance. Where now it's like
they did, but they didn't. Yeah.
Well, I would also argue that there was the last, I guess, since the mid 60s, certainly, and really since the 30s in America, it very much has been kind of the frog being boiled.
Yeah.
But, kind of like that slow ratchet effect that, Yarvin describes. But I do think that there was, I'll put it this way. A band like Pantera would not be allowed to exist in the year of our Lord 2020.
Oh God, not with the same mainstream success. Never.
Well, definitely. No. And so what I'm saying is that kind of there were more, I guess, to use a phrase from the elite series here, there were more rival castles. And as we've seen like more and more of those essentially get kicked over or puppets put in their place.
Yeah.
I think that what people are nostalgic for, if I can be so bold as to describe someone else's nostalgia for a time I wasn't alive in, it was kind of that sense of it was less monolithic. There were kind of things that were, I don't mean to say apolitical, if anything really can be, but kind of were less political in the exact same way. And that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't a 90s version of Pause, as I said earlier, or there weren't, topics that were considered radioactive at the time, but just that the things have gotten significantly worse since then. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they're as good as they could have been 30 years ago, but they were better than they were now.
Right. No, I think, and it's true. I was listening to the Twitter space, the Night Owl space with Nightmare Vision and Future Moldovan Citizen when that tweet blew up about the Michael Moore animation, where I think it was Future Moldovan that said like the anti-white stuff in certain sections of the political left in the 90s and early 2000s, it was like tolerated. It was like, we agree, fight the power, bro. But it wasn't like parroted and reverberated in like every mainstream institution. It was sort of like just a end goal. It was sort of like, it was typical like left-wing utopianism, the way that like unironic Marxists are in academia, where they're in this like weird position where they know it's like impossible and a pipe dream, but they still pretend like it's like around the corner. You know what I mean? Like it was that level of like, oh yeah, it's like certain segments of our coalition, our rainbow coalition, believe in this. And it's like, whatever, right? Like it's not a big deal as long as I'm going to, NYU or Berkeley and I'm like going to my March for Choice and I pick up, some some easy strange from the March from my women's studies class, right? So, but nowadays it definitely is like the main thing. And I think that, you're right. Like it is fascinating how in the span of like 15 to 10 years, or even like in the span of 5 years, how it went from this eccentricity of the political left to now this is like mainstream, or like it's forced mainstream opinion in America that you absolutely must believe in, especially during, the summer of Pink Floyd. It was like a literal religious awakening in America and throughout the world, actually, because throughout the, the rest of the world had this. And I think that, yeah, it's definitely like a sign of the times. And I think that a lot of people are coming to the conclusion that how do we orchestrate the same degree of religious revival, but on the political right? And I think certain issues are probably prime for that, because of the sheer fact of like the political left going so hard. I mean, but I think it's like people like Matt Walsh, and I hate to say it, even people like, Chris Rufo or whatever, like they get it somewhat, but they really don't. They don't understand that to orchestrate sort of like a mass scale religiosity or counter religiosity in society is not just like pointing out hypocrisy. It's going to take much more. It's going to take like the sort of mimetic contagions throughout various institutions that can all sort of sync up and create the conditions by which these religious revivals happen. And you must think of this in explicitly spiritual terms, in my opinion. I think
I completely agree, and there's a kind of ever evolving discourse on our side of things about what I kind of call like the DQ, the demon question, right? Which is like when is it an appropriate time to call someone a demon? Because there seem to be kind of like two broad camps, which is the come on, you're being ridiculous, just because this anime account has pictures of them getting like one shoved up the pooper by like a demi dragon boy doesn't mean they're possessed by the devil. And on the other side, you have like base Lutheran 1997 who's got like a glowing eye picture of Martin Luther.
I don't mean that. No.
Yeah, but there is something to be said for the fact that this isn't just I think that we've kind of like well and truly left the realm of kind of viewing things as moderate disagreements. There are kind of irreconcilable differences on very, very fundamental questions beyond. And I would argue that even if we look at kind of like the questions of the day that really divide people, they are ostensibly about things like, kind of like obviously like abortion, letter rights for the alphabet people, things like that. But those are really, when you kind of dig into them, those are very, very fundamental questions about like, well, what is it to be a functional human? Like what is appropriate, either like sexual behavior or like what is an appropriate, like essentially like what is a definition of life? And so to me, the thing that I do kind of, I guess, worry about is that the narratives, because I do agree that like we do kind of live in this like horrible, like hyper real postmodern soup, whatever you want to call it, that the narratives have become so divergent. I don't know if there's any way to kind of, what would you say, to kind of make them mesh in any way.
No, the whole dream of like common civil society is gone. That's just a lie. That wasn't real to begin with. But
I agree. But what would you call, these kind of like fundamental questions of narrative, like at a certain point that really is a religion, right? Like the grand narrative by which you order yourself, kind of the way that you view, your most fundamental obligations.
Yeah. And the meta narrative. Yeah. I think, Robert Anton Wilson called it reality tunnels, where, we're sort of we live in totally different ontologies, and we live in totally different ways of being and how we even think being is to begin with. It's
what frustrates me so much about the kind of, the moderate right is, to a certain degree, they profess our ontology, right? They profess our version of the true and the good, but they are at the same time still stuck within their own enemy's frame.
Yeah.
And there's an essay that I have half written that I might end up throwing up after this, essentially called like the white hat option. And the point of it is essentially that, and I've
like the UN white hats.
No. This is
we need our own base GigaChat UN white hats.
Maybe I think of another name for it. But essentially, right, it comes back to the analogy of playing, like cowboys and Indians. And if you've ever seen a cowboy movie, right, well, you always know that if they're black and white, well, the guy with the white hat, he's a good guy. And if he's got a black hat, he's a bad guy. And to a certain degree, by kind of stepping into our enemy's frame, we've been handed the black hat by default. Like, we have been handed the role of the bad guy. And everyone knows,
well,
exactly. And in any sort of narrative, right? Like, the resolution at the end is, well, you're the guy who gets kicked over the cliff. You know, you're the guy who gets shot at high noon. And so to me, it's so frustrating that I see these people who are, you know, making the same claims ostensibly that you and I would about like the true, the good, the beautiful, like the end of man, all these kind of like big, important questions are professing that out of one side of the other of their mouth, and out of the other, they're essentially signing up to lead those principles off a cliff, you know, to lead them to ultimate destruction. And to me, it's just incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. But what I mean is that I think that even if you don't believe in God or an afterlife or spirituality, you have to think of things. And I think this is like what Nick Land was getting at with his sort of vital materialism and, you know, in certain works like Thirst for Annihilation, where it's like, you know, they operate on a level that is subsomatic, that like, you know, these meme plexes, they operate on a level that is imperceptible to the normal framework of what like secular, you know, or post-religious materiality is. And they operate as such. And even if, you know, you don't have like James Lindsay especially is like a fedora tipper. He may not have a spiritual framework for things, but his enemies certainly do, even though they don't realize it, because they're just as much atheistic as he is in terms of post-Christian society. But I think that a problem is that like with religious trads, and I mentioned this recently on my my Patreon exclusive series, Giant Reviews. I was reading this article from Wired Magazine called Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And at the end, I mentioned about like there's this guy who's very popular among the Amarnites. His name is Lindy Observer. And he had this thread. I mean, his Twitter handle is @monkeyclearpill. And he had like, you know, the problem is like a lot of these, I know, yeah. These religious people, like the trads, they like to pretend that we live in the same sort of meta structures and the same like understanding and mindset and consciousness as people did in, say, 17th century France or in any era of Christendom, where these sort of like minutia of theological debates matters. And they do matter, but I think that they don't matter in terms of like the vast majority of people that we're dealing with, the vast like normie individual. They don't have that same understanding. But to like sort of go about and pretend and LARP like that they do is not productive. And so you get like a lot of like spurgy, like right wing, like not even right wing, because a lot of these people, they're just like, they'll disagree with huge segments of the political right. You'll get like these minute like theological differences between them, and then they'll attack the enemy in explicitly like, you know, terms that we understand, but they don't care about. And I think like, that's not what I mean. Like you can't really LARP something that isn't true. You have to reconcile the postmodern condition or the hypermodern condition that we live in. You have to reconcile the fact that maybe Zoomers are different, but like majority of millennials, even the ones that say that they're religious, they're not like, they don't really feel it in their hearts, in my opinion. They'll still like capitulate to Mammon or to Moloch if they have to. And so you just, that's the reality. And even me, myself as a Catholic, you have to realize that, you know, until a form of like revival, until a Reconquista can happen, which I think probably will. I know that Zoomers have like a bit more because of like the digital environment they've grown up in. They have a bit more of an impulse for a sort of spiritual understanding of things, even though that leads them to TikTok baby witches and like hideousness on the political left, you know, sort of like religious notions around intergenerational trauma and so forth. I still think like they have the tools, whereas millennials are just thoroughly rootless, Jon Stewart, Richard Dawkins, you know, they don't have that same capacity. They have this like autistic sort of repulsion to any sort of framing things in terms of spiritual terms. So, you know, that's what I mean. You have to deal with these things. You can't just ignore them. You can't just like LARP and pretend they're not real. So that's what I mean. But I think that as time goes on, we're going to start seeing the sort of consequences of that sort of like secular materialist worldview essentially not working. That because it can't work by definition. People are not like that. Even if you don't believe in God, even if you don't believe in any particular faith, you still have to realize that, human beings, like, we're looking at this through the West. The vast majority of the human population doesn't believe in this like atheistic materialism. You know what I mean? Like, not even political enemies. Political enemies are atheistic. I think that the left during the mid 90s to early 2000s, they kicked off their new age spirituality for this hardcore atheist materialism. But even then, they have to sort of like shrug their shoulders when it comes to quote unquote indigenous spirituality or Afro-American, whatever, you know what I mean? Like they have to sort of, they have to be at peace with that, even though I would argue that a lot of like, very like secular liberal Muslims and a lot of like African spirituality people and a lot of, even indigenous people, they don't actually believe metaphysically. It's just an identity issue for them, but they have to sort of like pretend that they believe because, it's an identity thing. Unfortunately, like the whole like thing about like these older neocons or these older like, people like Mark Stein, like they got it wrong. Like, Islam is in the West is just as susceptible to like liberal, post-history modernity as anything else. It's just that it's even worse because they still have an attachment to their sort of like identity, to their anti-Western identity. But it's like, I'm talking about like the obviously like the leftist Muslims, like the Hojabis. I'm not talking about like the actual Muslims, you know what I mean? Like it's yeah, that's a very complicated issue, but I'm sorry, I'm just rambling right now.
And to me, there's something about this that I really like and I realize Junger is a thinker who changed dramatically through his life.
Yeah.
But he kind of gets to this in the Forest Passage. And he essentially lays out that, look, like believing in God now is fundamentally different from believing in God before. And it goes back 100%. To what I said earlier, that it's a choice now, whereas before it was just kind of like the baseline.
It's never a choice.
Mode of being. But what he says, and he wrote this at kind of like the high water mark of ostensibly materialist atheism, which is kind of like during the rise of, the Soviet Union as a world power. Because I would kind of make the argument that the 20th century is kind of unique in its materialist atheism, and we're kind of seeing the repudiation of that currently.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons. Yeah. But he kind of makes the argument that, like, look, even within that, the religious impulse, the idea to worship never left humans. Nope. We may have pretended it wasn't there, but he describes very much, and this is oddly prescient for a man writing in the late 1920s.
Oh yeah, during Weimar. Oh my God, yeah,
definitely. Yeah. But he talked about, essentially how we commuted the role of priests to doctors, and kind of this like eternal cult of, wellness and mental health, albeit with, different names at the time, took that role of essentially like holiness and spiritual well-being.
Jung said the same. Yeah, Jung said the same. Yeah.
And you see this very directly. Like, look, I'm not Catholic. I'm a descendant of Huguenots, and and as such, very, very Protestant. But my point is that you see that in the kind of the practice of psychotherapy does have a certain resemblance to confession.
Yeah.
Right? Like there is something to be said for like there is someone essentially listening to your deepest, darkest sins. And despite, being quite Protestant, I do indulge in some E. Michael Jones every once in a while. And look, he has his issues. I won't deny it. But in Libido Dominandi, he describes how essentially that, that is kind of a perverted version of, confession. But instead of being, told to sin no more and, been given, essentially like a way to make your sin right, offer restitution, offer penance, you're essentially being told, like, all right, it's no big deal. Like everyone does it. It's because intergenerational trauma, to use a phrase you do.
Yeah, they don't use the same Freudian language of like libidinal energy or anything. That's like verboten, but now it's
you see the same type of ritual. And and so even in kind of like the belly of this ostensibly atheistic, materialistic world, you see the same motions. It's like we can never escape it, no matter how much we try to.
No, yeah, even Jung had the same point. Alan Watts had the same point. Even like Byung-Chul Han in Psychopolitics has a similar point about sort of therapeutic culture and the regime, the sort of what Thomas Sowell has called the therapeutic state. It's very much a part of biopower in a way. And nowadays, I think you have, especially with millennials, because I do think that we're on the verge of a huge, especially with millennial white women, a huge mental health crisis. And I think that, therapy culture, just go to therapy, live, laugh, love, like that sort of TikTok therapeutic thing, that is an expression of the sort of supreme anxiety or spiritual malady with the French in the turn of the century, which, I mean, the turn of the century, had a very similar condition to ours. They called it the mal de sac, the malady, the sickness of the century. So I think like we're going through another sickness of the century in the 21st century. I think that we're very much, it's sort of like the anxiety that they experienced during, it's certainly different. It's certainly different. I mean, well, and maybe if things go wrong with Russia, we'll experience another anxiety of a world war, but who knows? But yeah, probably not. But it's, the point being is that I think that it's different. It's not the same trauma that the greatest generation lived through, or even their grandparents lived through at the turn of the century. But it's still similar in that people experience immense amounts of, like, especially young men and even young women, especially, millennial women that are approaching 30s, their 30s now, a supreme loss of meaning and a supreme loss of purposelessness that pervades society. And I think that we have to really think of it as the sickness of the century again. I think we have to revive a lot of these writers that were in the Parisian writers at the time, people like Rimbaud, they, were talking about this, and even artists at the time as well. Like, I mean, Van Gogh was probably like the best expression of that. I know Van Gogh's, become part of the discourse this week because of the crazy no oil people. But yeah, you know what I mean? I think that this is ultimately the problem. But, again, I think we didn't cover the race thing. Yeah, I think you're kind of right. I mean, a lot of the race relations, I think, unfortunately, has been buried in the 90s and early 2000s. But yeah, it was definitely, the pressure cooker was still going. It was still there. I think that, it's hard to tell. Like in Canada, we have that as well with like Indigenous people. But I think America, it really is sort of like a pre-Rwanda, what type of environment. In America, like the discourse around race is just like so utterly insane. It's but I mean again, I don't know if I should say any more about this, but as a Canadian, but well, it's here too. It's here too, though. It's here too. Yeah.
I'm not gonna prognosticate. I don't know what's coming, but I'm quite sure that it won't be pleasant for anyone involved. I'll put it that way. So anyway, Gio, we're a little bit over time. I normally try to go for an hour, and we got to 150% of that. So do you have anything you want to say before we wrap up? You can handle plugs as well.
Oh, sure. No. No, I think that yeah, like I said, this week on Content Minded on Wednesday is the second Stain Haynes episode. I had it in my hard drive for a few months. Next week I'm gonna have a great interview with Soso that I'm gonna upload. Soso is one of the best Twitter posters. We talk about a bunch of things from the current war in Russia. War in Blue Yellow. Special military operation, which you're still calling it that. Special military operation. But we talk about we actually talk about right wing, like this thing of ours, as Thomas would say. We talk about the state of the E-right and its future, and we also talk about Texas history at one point. He's also a Texaner like Prude. And we talk. He's actually a descendant of the first 300 families in Texas. So we talk about that. So then this week on Thursday, we'll be on my channel, the Digital Archipelago, where I think me and Prude, we decided to review various passages from Xenosystems by Nick Land. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And of course, next week we'll do more of a Halloween themed episode on his channel. I wanted to do one about Kyle Autumn and Randy Stair and Saint Elliot, but then he's like, let's do a Patreon thing because I'm sure YouTube would like automatically flag it. yeah, you're right. Talking about mass, what's,
Yeah,
But,
it's a dangerous topic, right?
yeah.
So
But
anyway,
Kyle Autumn's fascinating, though. If you ever heard of it, you ever heard of Kyle Autumn?
I've not. No, you'll have to send me something on that. It sounds
He
interesting.
whatted. I forget what he placed. Was it his father? He believed he was possessed by an alien, and he had this manifesto that he had to go out and commit to fun posting on IRL. If you know what I mean, because of this alien that like inhabited his father and himself. So it's a crazy story. He actually did a drawing of the alien too.
Oh wait, was this the Danny Phantom guy?
No. That's Randy Stairs. Yeah, that's Randy Stair.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I saw it in the chat and that confused me. I do know about Randy Stair, but no.
Yeah,
Carry
Kyle
on.
Autumn is more of an obscure choice of fun posting IRL. But yeah. So but this week in the Digital Archipelago is going to be about accelerationism and xenosystems, and it's going to be great. So yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Gio. I really appreciate you for coming on. As far as
Patreon.com/Giant Productions.
Oh, that link.
I have to put that in there.
Mine are down there as well. This episode will obviously be appearing on YouTube. It will also be on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you can listen to podcasts within just a few hours. If you like my show, you want to support it, I have a subscribe star, I have a coffee link, and I have a Substack. All of those essentially gain you the same things, which is access to my, very infrequently updated paid Substack, access to audio versions of my backlog, and whatever other junk I threw up there. We did get a couple super chats. One, just a blank one from Marshall
Nice.
Forward, which we appreciate. And then Jose Nunez sent $10 and just said coffee ! Which is always something I can get behind. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night, everyone.
God bless. Goodbye.